Well, we made it online again. Welcome to SMAF July 2018. I have to think which year it is. Do you like my new camera angle, everyone? Getting berated for the background mess in my office, so I thought I'd actually show you what I'm doing. I will switch it in a little bit. As you know, I'm Dom Robinson. I am somehow spinning, I feel like a DJ today. I'm spinning tunes later at 11 o'clock on the Thursday night show, which you're welcome to tune in and have a little boogie to if you're still up. But right now, we're going to talk to some great people from the streaming industry about what's been going on in the news. So let me start introducing them. Eric, Eric, are you out there?
I'm out here, or in there, or somewhere.
Give us a little introduction. Tell us what you've been up to this last week.
Yeah, for those who don't know who I am, I'm the editor and vice president of Streaming Media Magazine and streamingmedia.com and the conferences. And lately what I've been doing is spending my time going over the submissions, and my son is trying to get me.
Come on, ask it.
He's wanting to know.
You got to get on camera now, Isaac. Okay. Anyway, just planning for Streaming Media West, which is coming up in November in Huntington Beach. We've got all sorts of new tracks there, including one focused on video engineering, one focused exclusively on OTT, a sports streaming summit. So we're covering the whole gamut of streaming-related topics. And with that, I will pass things over to Tim Siglin while I answer this burning technical question from my 9-year-old.
Well, I was going to say, he knows that Alex is on here, so he has a bunch of Hulu questions. So, what can we say? In fact, Eric, tell what he asked just before we went on the air.
He came in and asked if we had Cartoon Network, and I know we have Hulu, so I was able to ask Alex here, hey, is Cartoon Network on Hulu? He gave me the thumbs up, and so hopefully Cartoon Network will be keeping my son busy for the next 58 minutes.
If not, perhaps Alex can suggest a couple other things that are on Hulu that he can watch. So I'm Tim Siglin, a contributing editor with Streaming Media, founding executive director of Help Me Stream. And let's see, this week I have been trying to stay cool because it's really warm here. Not watch a whole lot of soccer, although with some of the teams that did well, I had to sort of step in and watch Mexico and like that. And then I've been working on figuring out transmission data rates, practical transmission data rates for 10 gig networks. All right, so let's see, Mark, I think you're next on the list.
Hello, I'm Mark East, and I firmly believe that you should always have Alex Zambelli on speakerphone in the background just so you can ask him questions. That's my standpoint, and I'm sticking by it. I run a company called Oh Media. We do lots and lots of live events, always live, always streaming. But other than that, we kind of run the gamut in terms of services that we offer. And I've just been wrapping up a mad rush of events over the course of the past couple of months, and we're finally seeing our typical summer lull. So we're starting to do some process reorg and things like that, and test new hardware and get things back in order. So this is my favorite time of year. and with
Mark,
that,
you've known our guest for some time, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. We've worked together for many years. When I was at iStream Planet, and so was he, and now he's BMOC at Hulu. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Mark. So my name is Alex Zambelli. I'm the senior product manager at Hulu for the playback experience. And as Mark mentioned, I worked at iStream Planet as well before Hulu with Mark. And before iStream Planet, I worked at Microsoft for 10 years and spent my entire career actually working in digital media space. So I've been working on everything from codecs, video compression to live encoders, and now I kind of cover the whole playback pipeline at Hulu. So yeah, I guess I'm your streaming media guy.
Alex, what got you into the space? Was there a first gig or a first moment where you suddenly fell in love with the science of streaming?
I think I didn't even think of it necessarily as streaming until probably, I think, once I got to Microsoft, and then, I was working in the Windows Media division at the time. I got interested in the whole space through video compression. That's what kind of pulled me in. And so as I dove deeper into, video and audio codecs, Then, you know, for a while, the focus was obviously on offline playback, but eventually, as you know, time progressed, then the focus shifted over to streaming, and that's how I got pulled into that.
It's interesting you say that, Alex, because for me, it was the same thing. I started in, well, motion picture, but then I got into video compression. And I don't really think I even thought of streaming as more than just another delivery medium besides DVD and VHS. And then suddenly it seems to dawn on you, oh, wait a second, this really is going to be the way that everything gets delivered. And you're living proof because you're in a company now that's one of the major deliverers of that kind of content.
Yeah, and I remember when I got into when I was at Microsoft, and you know, I was working in Windows Media at the time, and early on, Microsoft, you know, was investing a lot into streaming because there was really just Real Networks and Microsoft kind of competing in that space at the time. But then, as for example, like when Flash kind of took off and Microsoft, you know, lost a lot of that market share. There was actually not that many people left at Microsoft that knew both codecs and media. And I remember there was a period around like 2005, 2006 when Microsoft's focus shifted entirely towards the optical discs and doing HD DVD and Blu-ray. And I kind of became like the resident stream media expert, which was really weird just because there was nobody left who was focusing on both codecs and you know, knew the Windows Media space.
Well, and it's crazy because Steve Nathans-Kelly, who's one of the editors for Streaming Media Producer now, did something, Eric, it was called what, eMedia Live back in the day?
Well, it was eMedia Magazine, and that's how I got into streaming media. Was I signed on to work with Steve at eMedia Magazine, and eMedia was a trade publication for the optical disc industry, which when I signed on in 2002 was still going fairly strong. And then a few years later, the parent company, Information Today, that owned eMedia, it bought Streaming Media, and I got the opportunity to come over to the streaming media side, and needless to say, eMedia Magazine didn't last much longer then.
Well, and Steve shifted to Event DV Magazine, which was sort of an event-focused thing, kind of like what Mark does, but on the sort of the non-live space. So yeah, it's sort of fascinating how we all end up in the space. Alex, you mentioned you worked at Microsoft, and I know Chris Knowlton's now back there working on the Stream product, I believe is what it's called. Do you find that ex-Microsofties go out and then find they miss the evil empire and come back, or is it is it just something that you know, you get opportunities wherever you go and then you take them for the challenge?
I think it's more opportunity based. I think I certainly know people who have left Microsoft and then gone back. I think, you know, sometimes it's just, you know, personal preferences, you know, whether people want to, you know, work in Redmond, work in Seattle, that kind of thing. But I think with Microsoft, you know, what's both I think exhilarating and then frustrating at the same time for all of us who work there on media is that the focus shifts so quickly when it comes to media. Microsoft, like there'll be a hotspot of activity, you know, for 2-3 years, and a lot of focus on a certain product, and then, you know, the winds will suddenly start blowing in a different direction, and that focus will shift to something else. And so I think what happens often is that people will go and work on a product that's, you know, that's kind of hot and popular at that time, and then 3 years later, you know, they might move on to something else, and when another media opportunity comes up at Microsoft again, they might go back. So I think that's what drives some of this sort of churn that we see.
So one last question on that, and then we're going to go to the Flipboard with Dom, and we'll come back to you later. But what is it about Seattle? I mean, I know Grass Valley, for instance, it was the former Department of Defense stuff, you know, Loral, the space satellite. What is it about Seattle with video? Because clearly Amazon started as a book company, and although they bought Darren Giles and Dana Giles' company, you know, for the on-demand DVD publishing, which ultimately then led into Amazon Video, and you know, you had Ben Wagner and some of the other people who were in there. Was it just enough of a cluster in Seattle that you see continuing innovation there, or was there something even before sort of Microsoft that drove all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been somewhat circumstantial. I think, when Microsoft got into the game, into digital media, that certainly, created a lot of local expertise in digital video. I couldn't tell you why Real Networks, started here and not somewhere else. I mean, why here and not Silicon Valley? But certainly once Real Networks was here, then I think that that put the emphasis on video again. And so a lot of that local talent, I think, just never left, and they went to other companies. And so they went to places like Amazon. And again, Amazon, I think another sort of circumstance, happy circumstance that, they were a book selling company that was based out of Seattle, but then as they grew into the e-commerce giant that they are today, then eventually got into video. And so of course that ended up recruiting a lot of the same talent that's been working in video in this space for a long time. So at this point, I think we just have enough people in town that just know their way around stream media that, the chances of another, a new company starting up tomorrow that's going to be focused on stream media is quite high, I think.
Nice.
Cool. Excellent. So listen, Alex, as you know, what we do is we have a Flipboard magazine, which we share on the front of the SMAdvancedForum.com website, where some of the viewers will be watching this, and we use it to cherry pick topics over the month and share them collaboratively and keep track of what's latest or greatest in the industry and so on. So we had a little chat before the show and a little flip through them. Was there a particular topic of the day that stood out for you that you think's kind of the relevant story of mid 2018?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the story that came out in Forbes about how net neutrality sunset is prompting Sling TV's individual channel offerings, and I thought it was quite interesting. So maybe that's one we could start with.
Yeah, hold on. Let me just see if I can get that up between me and Eric. Give us a thumbs up if you get it. Eric, I'm racing to load it on my screen share. Don't you love the streaming technology? To be honest, it's quite amazing what you can do with one MacBook Air these days, which you couldn't do 20 years ago. There's a bit of a plug for Apple there. I'll have the sponsorship, please, Apple. So there you go. So this story, scan reading through it, is that Sling are going to start offering a la carte channels without requiring purchasers to have a subscription. It's what do we got here? I can't read quick enough. Did you have a chance to read through it before we brought it up, Alex?
I skimmed over it. I thought what was interesting was the connection that they were making between the net neutrality situation right now in the U.S. and then Sling's move to the a la carte model. So I don't know if everyone else has had a chance to read through it, but I'm kind of curious. Whatever. So
there's a mandate that the pay TV providers offer their channels on an a la carte basis. Sorry, there's been lobbying to get the FCC to mandate that, and the question is, why is it happening? And I think there is presumably an argument that's to do with the changes in legislation around net neutrality.
But what's interesting, Dom, is that in '93, the Telecom Act here was going to force the cable providers to do that. And Eric was mentioning it just before we started that I think Spectrum's now doing a la carte. But ultimately, it took the OTT companies moving that direction or taking the stranglehold away, maybe, in terms of the cable providers having connection or having all that content to then force us to get to this point. So whether it's net neutrality or not, I personally think it's a really good thing to start offering a la carte. And from my standpoint, I use over the air. So for me, I can't always watch stuff on OTT because I don't have a cable subscription, but I wonder if that model is also going to change here in the not too distant future as we move toward a la carte.
Tim, do you think part of that, obviously one of the big arguments behind the push for a la carte channels was that consumers say, look, I'm paying, $100 a month and I only watch a certain number of channels. Why am I paying for all these channels I don't watch? I think one of the things that's happened as people have cut the cord and move to the OTT services is that they're finding out that they're really not saving any money if they, subscribe to, let's say, Hulu or DirecTV Now and Netflix, and occasionally buy a movie through Amazon Prime or iTunes. At the end of the month, they're finally wise. They're finally getting wise to the fact that when they look at their credit card statement, they've spent almost as much as they would have anyway.
It's death by 1,000 cuts, sort of, as opposed to one big lump. I think that's part of it, Eric. I think the other thing was, about 5 years ago, there was an offering by a couple of the cable providers to say you can buy individual channels, but what they were doing was basically charging you for a single channel what it costs for you to get basic TV anyway. So their pitch, if you called and said, I just want HBO or I just want ESPN, was, well, that's fine, you can get it, it's $50 a month, but for $49 a month, we'll give you basic cable, and then you can add the other on for $5. So it, in some ways, when Congress pushed the whole thing in '93, the idea was there that essentially you were going to take the number of channels that you had, divide, let's say it was 20 channels for $50, you're going to divide it down by 20 and you would pay $5 a channel. Well, that wasn't mandated, that didn't happen, and it wasn't until, at least in my mind, this external pressure of the OTT skinny bundles that's really sort of forced the traditional cable provider to try to come back and do that. And obviously Sling, as an OTT provider itself, maybe has structured its license models in such a way that it can actually do this at an inexpensive per channel price.
Yeah,
Tim,
one of the other things.
Sorry.
Alex.
No, I was just going to ask Tim, how much do you think, you talk about how, it used to be that you would, sort of get these deals, right, where your cable provider would, try to offer you discounted cable service if you sign up for internet service as well. I always got the impression that was really just them kind of, pouring water from one bucket into the other, right? Like trying to just shift business really from one division to another, essentially, because I think they saw where they saw the future was on the internet side and not necessarily on the cable TV side. Sure.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it was a model where they were told they had to do it. There wasn't really enforcement. There was definitely not enforcement on price. So if, like in any regulatory model, if somebody says you have to do it, then the answer could be, sure, we're going to do it, but it's going to cost you, less than $1 difference, say, between what we normally offer you and what you're getting now. One thing I did notice, I guess it was late 2016, early 2017, I moved and I got Comcast Xfinity. And with that, I had the model of doing Comcast Xfinity, just the internet bundle, or for an extra $4, I could get the HBO Now capability, which was kind of nice because that meant they understood as a cord cutter, I didn't want TV. And since I didn't want TV and I was going to stream things, they were going to try to figure out some way to get a little bit of incremental money from me. The paying threshold of $4 to $5 wasn't bad at all if I'm only paying $39.99 for the internet service itself. So yeah, I do think it was sort of a bucket to bucket, but maybe now what's happening is the buckets are suddenly getting smaller, and so they're getting spillover, so to speak, and having to really try to figure out that model.
So some of the detail on that story is that there was a bundling that was going on some while ago, which could have been argued that it was violating net neutrality because the bundle was giving away free data to mobile customers who subscribed, in that case, to DirecTV. But because of the change in law now, there is an issue there is an argument that companies that are more vertically integrated have efficiencies which are not available to companies that lack vertical integration. I personally, I think that sounds confused. I think most net neutrality arguments always seem to be confused with so many things. They just seem to be a good way to get lobbyists paid.
But here's a practical example of that. AT&T said in their pitch to buy, Time Warner, that they were going to actually see economies of scale and they could drop the price. immediately within 2 weeks of the deal being approved, they'd now raised the price on their their video offerings. So yeah, I mean it's extremely convoluted, but I think to Alex's point, sometimes it's just accounting restructuring as opposed to actual innovation.
Now that's a beautiful segue, that story, and that was a perfect choice for us, Alex, to kick us off, because the next story that we had on our list was about why cord cutting is getting a little bit more expensive. I think correct me if I'm wrong, Eric. You're probably closer to the screen than I am, but I think the story basically is talking about an approximate increase of about $5 a month on most streaming services.
Right,
Maybe,
and it was
yeah.
When AT&T announced the price increase for DirecTV, as Tim said, everyone immediately pointed to the merger that was just approved and said, aha, see, as soon as the merger got approved, they raised their prices. They said they weren't going to do it, but they raised their prices. But I mean, I think most of us in the industry have seen this coming for some time, haven't we? And it all comes down to the cost of the rights for the content. It's rather than something more nefarious.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Eric. I think people forget that, you know, even the digital MVPDs have to license the content too, and I think a lot of them, you know, it's quite likely that they were operating at a loss when they launched and they were introducing, because a lot of the services when they launched, like Sling TV and YouTube and so on, they had multi-tiered packages, right? They had sort of like the entry-level package, and then your sort of medium bundle, and then your sports and premium content bundle. And I think if you want to offer some of the people at $15, $20 a month, like, you're probably taking a loss. That would be my guess. And so I think what we're seeing is probably them finally now kind of catching up to the realities of where their subscription numbers are versus like what their operating costs are. And I think that's where this is probably coming from.
And obviously the net. Sorry, Tim, go ahead.
I was going to say one thing I would add is that DirecTV was doing that bundle for right up until the merger was approved, where you would buy 3 months worth of service, prepay for 3 months worth of service, which was essentially $105, and you would get a free Apple TV 4K 32 gig. Prior to that, it had been 4 months of prepay. Now it's back to 4 months of prepay, and they raised the price. So while I agree there is definitely that licensing question and the taking a loss, Eric, I do think that the timing of it is really suspect. That's just my hope.
Yeah, well, obviously, I mean, I guess we'll never know, will we? But it sure does seem like it was an odd coincidence.
Dom, you were going to say something about Netflix?
Yes. So there is an article. It's somewhere in there which is talking about Netflix, Disney trying to catch up with Netflix. And actually, I was going to make a broad comment about how 5-10 years ago, the metric of measure in the streaming industry was either how many concurrent viewers you've got on a live stream, or how many gigabytes or petabytes of data you shift a month, or whatever. And now the conversation's been elevated up several layers in the finance sector, and the topic, or the number that seems to be appearing more and more in the news as I filter things into Flipboard, seems to be content spending. It seems to be there's a rather rude expression I don't think I should use here, but there's a sort of showing off by large companies that want to boast about how much they're spending on original content and so on. So you've obviously seen there's rumors about Apple starting to look at spending $1 billion on content this year alone. That's a huge number. And Netflix is tens of billions, fives of billions, I don't know. It's astronomical quantities of money suddenly being pumped into the content industry. I think that's great. I don't think that would be happening without streaming. I think some of the original content is just so much better, such a higher standard than we're used to on broadcast TV so consistently now. But I think it's interesting if there's pushback for the consumers to try to get cheaper and cheaper services. That means we've got to get bigger and bigger audiences faster. I just wonder what people think about the scaling of the infrastructure and whether we're keeping up with it. Whether you've probably got some insight on that, Alex, because you sit near the distribution infrastructure for reasonably large platform. Are you completely happy that you can run across multiple CDNs, expand into the cloud, run the servers you need to run when you need to run them? Or are there still challenges if the audiences shift from the sort of 5s and 10s of millions into the 50s and hundreds of millions that TV ratings agencies pretend that people get on traditional broadcast?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there are challenges of scaling the operations from 1 million viewers to 10 million to 100 million, and I think it's going to be interesting, at least for Hulu to see how we basically scale as our subscriber base grows, because we're at about 20 million right now in the US, and which is great for us, and it's the kind of growth that we're hoping for. But yeah, like when you compare that to where Netflix is, and when you compare that to where obviously we all want to be, because I think we all want to eventually replace some of the traditional broadcast methods, then yeah, like we definitely have a lot of challenges to overcome, I think, when it comes to just scaling those just the content delivery. Well, one thing I was just going to go back to that you guys were discussing was the money spent on original productions, things like that. I mean, I was just quickly Googling what Netflix's sort of cash flow is at, and looks like they were expecting about a $2 billion negative free cash flow in 2017, according to a Business Insider report I was just looking up. I think that just illustrates that. And I think it might explain why we're seeing some of the challenges around a la carte pricing with live linear, is that even if you're doing just VOD, even if you're just doing basically original productions and you're just trying to fill your content library for your VOD offering, getting that to be profitable is very difficult, right? Like actually making more money from subscribers than you're spending on the original content is very difficult. So I think that then tells you why I think content owners on the live linear side are so, it's not easy to get a la carte pricing in place, because then that cost, that's something that then the MVPDs have to also make up, right? They have to make money and not just spend money on licensing.
Mm. And do you think the sports space is going to disrupt that? Because obviously that's kind of at the moment, as far as I know, that's sort of a little bit outside of Hulu's focus. But sports is obviously big. We were talking about eSports a lot at the end last week, and eSports seems to be cutting some edges in terms of the scale of audiences.
Which is definitely a big driver, I think, for live linear. I mean, we've seen that in the OTT space as well. Is that if you started a new DMVPD, for example, and you said, okay, we're going to offer live linear, but the only live linear channels you offered were the ones that carried movies or TV series or whatever, I think it would probably be unsuccessful. I think what draws the audience in is sports and live news. Because those are the actual things that are live, right? For everything else, people, if you offer it to them on demand, they will watch it on demand. And so as long as the big broadcasters, I think, have exclusive broadcast rights to things like the NFL and NBA and so on, I think we're going to see live linear still be important and relevant when it comes to even in the OTT world.
Hey, I want to make a comment real quick. Alex, you were talking about making the money back from production. What I find interesting is that so Netflix has been at this for a couple of years, and besides the fact that they're spending money on production, they've also got a really nice tiered service, and they tier it in a really simple way by the number of screens that you're going to simultaneously watch. So what is it? Basic is 1, the next step up is 2, and then there's 4. And now they're prepping this Ultra series, or Ultra pricing model, which is basically going to probably be geared toward 4K on multiple screens as opposed to more screens. that model sounds really simplistic, but yet they've been very successful in that, because I know people who will pay just the low end so they can have a single screen, you know, a single person in an apartment, versus somebody who's a family that wants multiple screens going. Do we see that model increasing across the industry, or is that just Netflix figuring it out and sort of accelerating from that standpoint?
I think it's an interesting model. I think it's one of the possible business models, and I can't say if it's necessarily the right one. I think you're right. I think it is a bit of an experiment, right, to see, is that where people see the added value? Because the other thing that Netflix has also been doing is they also are trying to create value around like video and audio quality, for example, right? So you got your HD plan, you got your UHD plan, and then it looks like they're going to be introducing, like the top tier might be HDR only, or that's the only one where you get HDR. And so I think they're trying to create value around the visual and the audio experience as well. The question, of course, is like whether consumers will see the same way. And so it might work, it might not work. So yeah, I can't say it's necessarily like the only model or the right model. I think it's, I think the entire industry is in a experimental phase when it comes to that.
And I could see them doing, extra to cover the extra bits, so to speak, raising the price from that or using that as the argument out into the industry. But I really like the multi-screen model. Now, the argument could be, obviously, you could share your password with multiple people who don't live in the same household. But at the end of the day, that's possibly going to happen anyway, regardless of whether you do one screen or two screens or four screens. So, all right. Don, sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to get back to the discussion of sports and live linear services and bring Mark in, because Mark, you've done a lot of work in the eSports arena, no pun intended. One of the things, as we talk about the value of sports on these live linear services, is I haven't really seen eSports move into those services and become part of the offering. The live eSports events that I'm familiar with are isolated, perhaps happening within platforms like Twitch, but I'm not going into Hulu Live or DirecTV Now and seeing an esports tournament come up on my suggestions or upcoming live events. Do you think that's going to happen, and is it going to happen anytime soon, Mark?
I'm not sure. I think Alex could probably speak to, who maybe he can reveal, who Hulu's been talking to. There are always rumors, Blizzard's always talking to all of the VPTs, about, creating new original content and that sort of thing. Twitch keeps, releasing press releases hinting at, new original shows and things, but it's usually in the form of single documentaries and single 6-episode shows that they're creating. It's never really a true OTT play. So yeah, I think for the time being, it's really going to be a live events based thing. Regardless of what the numbers are. The viewership numbers for some esports properties are through the roof, but they're very much on a live event basis. Yeah,
just going to cut in there, actually, Mark. There was an article we had about esports volumes, which Goldman's talking about hundreds of millions of viewers. They're giving a figure in the article. Where did I see it? 167 million people already watching esports on a monthly basis around the globe. Yeah, just to support what you're talking about, they're certainly, I think they're pushing some boundaries. Those are, I don't know what the individual events are getting though. That's probably millions of events though. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're speaking in terms of when they say 300 million viewers, and I think that's actually a conservative estimate. They're saying by 2022. That's pretty conservative when you consider we're already over half of that in 2018. So, but I think they're talking about unique viewers worldwide, right?
Yeah. That's a worldwide figure.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly logical. I'd like to see their math and figure out how they arrived at that conclusion. But I don't see that being outside the realm of possibility. What I find interesting is when further down in that article they talk about the upcoming Overwatch League Championship being the largest esports event ever. which is unusual. Like they'll probably have the largest web viewership ever, but they're talking about the actual event in there and the fact that they sold out the Barclays Center, which only holds 20,000 people. And the League of Legends championship that happened last year was the Beijing National Stadium, which holds 80,000 people. So I'm not sure where they're getting that number, but yeah, it's you know, like we've talked about on almost every episode of this show, metrics are all over the place. And
it's a Goldman analyst who went out of the office for a sandwich and spotted it going on.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was in between breaks and football matches, right, Dom?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you mentioned it. You mentioned football. You mentioned football. Sorry, go on, Mark.
To pull it back into what we were talking about, I think, you know, innovating on technology is one thing, and I think all the VMPPDs are doing that. But I think it's more important to innovate on original live content as opposed to original programming. When Apple says they're spending billion with a B dollars on original programming, they're talking about new series. They're talking about, you know, stuff that you're going to buy on their platform individually, like per show. They're not talking about OTT channels. They're not talking about anything like that, and they're certainly not talking about live content. So to get back into, you know, even if there's no live linear esports, there are live linear sports channels that, you know, I think are the big draws for these platforms at this point, right? Would you agree, Alex?
Yeah, I agree, and I think one of the things that this actually highlights for me is that there's still a distinction, a very clear distinction in OTT between live linear and live events, right? Like we talk about sports being part of the live linear offering, right? Because it's, you know, traditionally it's always been licensed to that traditional broadcast world. And so when we talk about something like the NBA, like we're talking about really live linear most of the time, but when we're talking about something like esports, we're talking about live events. And so I think that's really interesting, is that as much as it may seem like, you know, we're at a point where, you know, live OTT is prevailing, like I think it's they're two very separate worlds, right? They haven't really been combined yet. I think it's going to be interesting to see which one of the, you know, new digital MVPDs starts, you know, picking up more and more live events and incorporating that into their offering. And then, you know, from the other perspective, you know, to see like, you know, does eventually somebody like Twitch or Mixer or some of these other platforms get into live linear, right? And then are we going to see those two worlds merge eventually?
There was a story somewhere in the magazine last month that Microsoft are rumored to be considering investments into the gaming space, or have gone public. There's something, I can't remember the story now, to flip through the flipboard to find it, but there's so much activity in that space. Now, it's not all perfect though, and Tim mentioned the F word, and I know nothing about it. I
didn't think I was allowed to say that on the air.
It's all Bayesian motion to me, but I did find the story about Australia buggering up the World Cup streaming quite interesting, and that was doing the rounds. So
yeah, that was Optum, who was the company who won the streaming rights. And I think to Alex's point on live linear versus live events, I think one of the problems we're running into now is who owns the rights for television also has traditionally owned the rights for streaming. Now it's starting to begin to be separated. And so Optum, that was their focus, was just doing the streaming part, not the television broadcast necessarily. Fox here in the States, it's the same thing. For instance, I can watch on my over-the-air TV, I can watch Fox, so I can watch half of the games in the World Cup, but I don't have FS1, so then I'm reliant on going back to OTT after a goal is scored to catch up and watch the highlights because I don't have an account, you know, that I can use. I think we're in that really strange ground, going back to what Eric said initially, where people look at their credit card bill at the end of the month and they realize they spent a whole lot of money for a whole bunch of little options on it. And as sports becomes more fragmented in terms of live linear licensing, I think we're going to see a whole lot more of that rather than a whole lot less of that.
Now, to tell me something, right at the bottom of this article, strangely, Eric, can you scan down to the very bottom of it? It's interesting that the only technical insight I got from that article was a comment that streaming tech company Uyala sent out a warning to TV networks at the start of the World Cup that this year's event may well be the last hurrah for traditional broadcasters against mounting pressures from OTT over-the-top streaming services. Now, I find it slightly interesting that Uyala is the only tech company I know that's mentioned in there. Does anyone know if they were involved in this delivery? I don't want to pick on them in particular, but it might be interesting to find out the backstory.
I think Uyala is now owned by Telstra, isn't it?
Yeah,
it is. They wrote it down, but it is still owned by Telstra. Yeah. So that's the strange thing. I don't know how Optum and Telstra fit together.
right. I don't know if they're related, but I just wondered if anyone had any technical insights. What the challenge was? Was it sort of server side or network side? My hunch is it was probably not network side. I think network issues are relatively easy to plan for. But anyway, if anyone out there listening, or if it suddenly comes to mind, or somebody Googles it and finds it, do let us know. That would be good. Right.
It's typically, I find, if I can just add, I find that it's typically an access issue. I'm just guessing here, but I have a feeling from some indications in that article that they had, massive flash traffic, and their, authentication servers weren't able to keep up with it. And to that point, having worked on a few Olympic games over the years, there's always, hundreds of rights-holding broadcasters throughout the world, many of which create their own, streaming entities and that sort of thing. This is what happened here for the World Cup with Optus, but invariably, many of them screw up royally, and many, streaming viewers are left out in the cold. But the numbers have never been where they would need to be for that to be big news. Do you know what I mean? Now the numbers are where they are, where if Optus screws up the streaming delivery of the World Cup, it's huge news because, millions of viewers were out of luck. So I think that's the difference here. Is not that they did, they screwed something up, more thoroughly than anyone had in the past. It's that they disappointed many, many more people by doing so this time.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's interesting too, in looking at the information about them, they're a mobile service provider. So if Optus is having trouble with authentication and their business is built around authentication of devices for content access, you have to wonder how many other events have this same kind of issue. Not on this scale, but just on a consistent basis. Mark, do you have any sort of insight into that? I know Dom's written before about how authentication has caused problems at the beginning of major events, but do you have a sense, is that a continuing problem?
Well, I think it's the thing that's commonly overlooked. I don't know, Dom, if you've had the same experience with your customers, but I feel like everyone focuses on video delivery and scalability of their video delivery, but very seldom is or access controls and authentication servers and license servers and that sort of thing are those taken into as much consideration. So I think if there's ever a weak link, it tends to be that, like I mentioned.
Yeah, we had a baptism of fire with a golfing event probably 15 years ago, and we had a flash crowd arrive, and we had a fairly basic intelligent request router, just something which handled the incoming request and redirected them to the correct server. And we learnt a lot that day about flash crowds and how servers can be overloaded and how a weak link can really ruin a weekend. So yeah, it does take something.
Dom, one thing that struck me in reading that article about what happened in Australia was, as you said, that quote from Uyala, basically saying this could be the last hurrah for broadcast when it comes to the World Cup. Reminded me a little bit of before the Merriweather-McGregor fight, which we know had authentication problems as well as problems. New Lion, which was involved with delivering that event, actually came out in the Hollywood Reporter or Variety or something before the event, talking about their involvement and really hyping it up. It all and then ended up with egg on their face through no fault of their own necessarily. I see that quote or that story and the Uyala quote, and I wonder if there's a bit of arrogance there on the part of some of the OTT services, or not the services, but the vendors in the space, perhaps getting out a little bit over their skis, to mix metaphors.
I think it's a very symptomatic of an industry sector being disrupted. You know, that the news. Who is this article with? This is CNET. So the traditional broadcasters, the traditional media per se, I think have been threatened for a long time, and they're in reality they have to be accepting of streaming media. They're leveraging it. They're doing stuff in that space, but at the same time, I think as you get ousted by a scrappy do that's coming and biting your ankles, it's quite easy to point the finger at any little mistake they make in any error. I think we've
and I have to say I'm disappointed with Eric, because I thought Eric was going to go to George Bush standing on the aircraft carrier saying mission accomplished. And instead he went for another technical thing. Come on, Eric, you're falling down on the job from your Wisconsin.
Yeah, my apologies.
As much as I love to be optimistic about, you know, the direction in which the OTT industry is going, I do feel like maybe we all jumped the gun a little bit with their declaration of broadcast industry's impending death. Because one thing that strikes me about that sort of proclamation is that, I mean, the broadcast rights are usually sold far in advance, right? So I was just looking up the 2022 World Cup, and the broadcast rights are already sold for that, right? So if you look at, you know, or Olympics, you know, same thing, right? Like typically get sold 1 or 2 Olympics ahead. And oftentimes like these are like 15 or 20-year deals. So if you're looking at somebody like NBC, who's got the Olympic rights in the US, or Fox right now has the World Cup broadcast rights. I don't, whether this is the last hurrah for broadcast really depends on like whether those entities are going to be relying more on OTT in the 4 years, or they're going to be relying still on traditional delivery methods. And I think in 4 years, I don't know that OTT is going to be necessarily where the majority of the traffic is.
And I think to bring back something that, again, we've talked about many times before, it's really pouring water from one bucket to another. It's all the same players in the broadcast space that are in the OTT space right now to a certain extent in terms of, you know, corporate ownership and that sort of thing. So, you know, you've really got no one's a loser here. If by 2022, you know, 100 million more people are watching the World Cup on what's technically OTT as opposed to broadcast, who cares? It's still the same people making the same amount of money virtually.
It's going to be hopefully hard to distinguish, to be honest, in a few years' time.
Yeah.
Right. So, Alex, let's just ask you what's cool in your world at the moment on the tech front. So let's step well away from the streaming business per se and ask what's interesting you at the moment technically. You know, pick something. I don't want to prompt you.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like at Hulu, we are, you know, trying to improve the quality of our video and audio, both on the VOD and live side. So that's something that I've been working on, you know, for the past year. And it takes, you know, it's a lot of effort to, because a lot of people, you know, look at, you know, a service that they, you know, subscribe to, and they say, well, you know, why doesn't it have, you know, Ultra HD, or why doesn't it have, you know, Dolby Atmos audio or things like that? And it actually takes, you know, a lot of work to implement these technologies across the board, because it requires not just updating a bunch of apps, but also updating like the entire just, you know, contribution and distribution pipelines and workflows, and even like the operational side of things. So it's a lot of effort. One of the things that I've been working on lately, for example, is enabling just 60 frame per second video playback for live TV. Across Hulu's service. And so that's more challenging than you might expect, required, you know, working with our vendors that are providing the live streams to us. It required enabling a lot of the pipeline to, you know, handle the additional bandwidth. And then the most challenging part, almost kind of surprisingly, was just making sure that when you deliver, you know, a 720p 60 video stream to a device, and you think that device is going to be able to handle it, that it actually can handle it. Because as it turns out, a lot of devices will say, "Oh, sure, we can decode 720p 60 video." But then once you sort of layer a lot of the app overhead on that, and, you know, memory constraints and CPU constraints that like that comes with, suddenly that 720p 60 doesn't look like 60 FPS anymore because the device is dropping frames all over the place. And so one of the things we had to do is actually make sure that we have a very dynamic delivery system where we can, target specific devices, specific device families, and say, okay, we're not just going to send 720p 60 to all Fire TV devices, but we're going to send them to very specific models that we have tested and know that can handle that sort of playback. So that's one of the things I've been working on. Really is just catching up in terms of video quality on the live side. Because that's one of the gaps that OTT historically has had, I think, with traditional broadcast and cable, is that cable was always obviously ATSC has dictated a certain level of quality, and the specs have always, it's just something we're used to, right? Seeing 60 frames per second, seeing 720p or 1080i quality, and then on the in the OTT space, it always felt a little bit like it was good enough, but not quite up to the same standard. And so we're trying to bring it up to the same quality standard so that we got, fluid motion, that we got, highest resolution possible, that we have, the best audio quality possible. So that's one of the things. And then something else that's interesting, I'm sure you guys will find interesting, is that we are starting to deploy more HEVC on the VOD side. So we are actually starting to convert a lot of our content library to HEVC, and then starting to deliver that to more and more devices. And it's one of those things that we haven't really talked about very publicly, because it's not a customer feature in the sense that customers necessarily see the impact. But it's something that we're hoping is going to improve the overall quality of experience for customers, because if we can provide better quality video to them at the same connection speed, that's obviously better for the users. If we can provide same quality video at less bandwidth, then that's better for us, since we're going to save some content delivery costs there. And in general, right, it feels like it's time to start moving on to newer codecs anyway. So yeah, we are starting.
So tell me, Alex, how do you manage the transition of codecs? Obviously there comes a point where the audience is simply demanding it, and you've got to deliver it. But at what point do you start thinking about introducing new codecs and new options into the workflow? And is it cost driven? I was talking to someone in the codec space a couple of weeks ago, and they said that they were finding the industry was more quality and reach driven than cost driven. Which I thought was a really stimulating comment. I wouldn't say I necessarily agree or disagree with it, but I think it's an interesting comment.
I mean, some of it is cost driven, and I think if you're primarily only cost driven, then I don't know if that's enough of a argument for introducing new codecs, because the reality is that every time you introduce a new codec, you're going to have to probably double up your content library for a while. You're gonna double up your even your storage and your delivery costs, because it's not a smooth transition. It's not like you can just say, okay, we're gonna shut off AVC and then we're gonna turn on HEVC, and it's gonna we're gonna transition everything 100% from one codec to another. There's going to be a period of time where you're going to be running in parallel. You're going to be delivering both H.264. You're going to be delivering H.265. Maybe you're also delivering, VP9. Maybe you're also delivering AV1, right? So the more codecs you add, actually, that increases your cost, both on the storage side, potentially licensing cost as well. So it's not cost. I think a lot of times it's the technology and it's the user experience. I mean, one example with HEVC in particular is that a lot of the, for example, HDR standardization is only around HEVC. So if you want to deliver HDR video today that's actually compatible with the majority of the devices out there, you're probably looking at doing it with HEVC and not with VP9 and certainly not with H.264. Not because it's technically impossible, right? There's ways to make it work, but there's just fewer devices out there that will support HDR in the context of those other codecs. And so HEVC sort of becomes almost driven by the technology that you want to deploy. So if you're looking at deploying 4K Ultra HD, you're looking at deploying HDR. If you're looking at deploying, 360 video, something like that, basically that's almost automatically going to disqualify an older, less efficient codec just because of the extra bandwidth required. And then because of the standardization that happens around codecs like HEVC, you're probably going to be leaning more towards HEVC than some of the other new generation codecs.
So battery power, is that I would have thought, even though the old UHD 88K, project it on a building quality video is really important, but there's very few people with devices like that. But the lion's share, presumably, is on tablets and iPads and iPhone, on smartphones and so on. So presumably, battery life is a key consideration these days with codecs, or certainly the decoder.
Yeah, I think that's something where for now we're not too concerned about like the battery life, or just like the impact that will have necessarily on battery life, because if we can always monitor that and then throttle that back if we notice that, for example, it is cutting battery life short on devices. Right now, like, our priority is let's make better quality available, and then let's decide how much we need to throttle that back, or how much we need to cut back on the availability of it. But step one is like, let's make sure that we can reach as many devices as we can with the highest quality possible, and then we can sort of fine tune it and optimize it around things like battery life.
Hey, Alex, quick question. You mentioned the HEVC and HDR. Are you doing much with 1080p 60 in AVC, or is the move more toward 4K HEVC?
We're definitely looking at 1080p 60. We're actually looking at 1080p 60 in the context of live,
right, sure.
Because there's a particular challenge with OTT in that. So, kind of going back to the topic of live linear and how that translates into the OTT space, right? With live linear, the highest quality, according to the older ATSC standard, was 1080i. But obviously, in the OTT space, we are progressive. We don't do video, and so then the challenge becomes, how do you basically try to take advantage of 1080i live linear video sources in the OTT space? And I think the solution is to basically, deinterlace into 1080p 60 as upstream as possible and deliver that video as 1080p 60 to the end clients. I think for compatibility reasons, AVC H.264 is still probably going to be the primary codec for that. But we do start hitting fairly high bit rates once you go up to 1080p 60, 10 megabits and up probably.
Well, and especially if you try to do 10-bit on the AVC side, that's where HDR plays a lot better than in 8-bit. So you have to go to something like HEVC.
Yeah, I mean, I try to decouple HDR from resolution in general. So when I think of 1080p 60, whether that's HDR or not, I think it's orthogonal, right, to the question of HDR.
Got it.
So, I mean, right now with live linear, everything's still SDR. I know there's obviously some testing and experimentation happening, but I think we're still a few years away from seeing more HDR distribution in the live linear space. So as Hulu gets into HDR, it'll probably happen first on the VOD side. And I think on the live side, we'll just have to kind of follow where the industry is going and when the broadcasters are ready, really.
I've been reading a lot of the HDMI specs this week, and it's amazing how many people are trying to force HDR at 8-bit just because that's what, that's the number of devices that are out there. So Dom asked me to kind of work through toward a wrap up. And Mark, I'm going to show a couple of these units, and then you can mention the ones that you've got. We were talking about portable webcasting units. Just to give you an idea in terms of size, here's a Mac Mini. This is what a Mac Mini looks like, and it used to be a mini thing. Now we've got webcasting units that are this size inside it, and we've got newer webcasting units that are even smaller inside that. The trend in these is they're Facebook Live or YouTube Live capable. There's some limitations on them. I'm doing a comparative review that I have to turn into Eric. I know by July 8th. That's the last day he told me I can turn it in. Dom, show yours, and then that sounds bad. Show your device.
Let's do that on video.
And then
Whip it out, Dom.
The Tic-Tac encoder has got a box. Yay! Audio encoder with built-in streamer coming soon.
Awesome.
That's
Mark,
all
yours?
for the moment.
What are the ones that you got?
So we do a lot of, like I've probably mentioned before, we do a lot of work with Zixi for backhaul and that sort of things, contribution from various customer sites and things. So we've been looking at a number of similar solutions to yours. This is the Osprey Talon G1, very, very small form factor, slightly larger form factor, but you know, higher capabilities would be the T21's AVC encoder. They also have an HEVC 4K encoder that's exactly the same form factor. A little bit pricier, but the commonality here is that both of these units support Zixi, and one of them, the T21, also supports SRT. So we're looking at them as true contribution encoders, but they also both, you know, support RTMP. The T21 supports HLS as well. So, you know, we're looking at these as being kind of, you know, problem solvers out in the field, not just for contribution, but for you know, stream encoding to platforms like YouTube and Twitch and things like that. So.
We ran into an interesting problem at Stream Media East where we had one of these devices to use. We connected to the Ethernet, and we then connected the camera in, the audio in, and like that. And it kept looking like we were going out to Facebook Live, but it turned out we had to go actually click on the splash screen to approve using, you know, the terms of service. And it turned out the device didn't even have an ability for us to do that, so we had to talk to the company. They pointed us toward where we could get an updated firmware. We did it, but then it took us an extra 3 steps to get in, log in, and actually go just click that one single, I agree to the terms. Have you run into that kind of thing, or are you doing that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I find that, I mean, these are 2 of like 6 small form factor encoders that we've been looking at lately, and the commonality with every single one of them is UI, UX, integration with platforms. They all try to integrate with YouTube, Facebook, some of them Twitch, etc., where they'll use the API to log in, create your event, start and stop the event, and that sort of thing. But that integration is always pretty weak. And so we end up not using it at all. We just spit out RTMP to an entry point somewhere, and that's about that.
You just need to enter the RTMP details on that one.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's enough of a shameless plug. So I think that's bringing us a little bit over. You see my atomic clock here. It says we're over. Now that's just going to confuse everyone in different time zones. So I'm going to take myself upstairs and sack myself later for letting us run over by 3 minutes. We haven't done that before, but that was our anniversary SMAF as well. Did you know that, chaps?
Oh, very good.
Happy anniversary.
I think this is our 13th. So, well, it depends because we did a couple of practice runs before we went live, so I never know whether to count them or not. But Alex, it's been wonderful to have you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join us again in due course. Are you going to be at IBC this year?
Yeah, I will be at IBC, so I will see you guys there, hopefully. And yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun, and happy anniversary of the show.
And we'll be on the beach at IBC in 2 months' time. Next month, we've got Brett Martins and Steve Miller-Jones from Limelight coming on. Well, from some CDN or other. We're not making a big deal about where people are from here. And we've had Mark East from, tell us where you're from, Mark.
Onano Media.
And he'll be on, as always, next month. And Tim Siglin from Help Me Stream.
Yep.
See you next month as well. And Eric, we're busy writing articles, aren't we? I've got to write you a preview for my 25 years of internet radio history by tomorrow lunchtime or something.
What about OTT and microservices?
Yeah, that's not due for a few weeks.
Oh, and by the way, your columns do as well, just in case.
Let's not do that here. Eric, play us this thing to play us out. Alex, once again, thanks very much. We've been SMAF, and we'll see you next month.